So thanks very much. I'm really happy to be presenting this paper right after a paper on seminars. Our paper is about a different kind of meeting and the gender dynamics in that meeting. It's about the meetings of board of directors. And so what we're going to look at in this paper is the relationship between board of directors networks, and I'm thinking about professional and social networks, the gender of those networks, and the performance of the bank. So there's two facts that are two observations that are motivating our work. One of them is probably not surprising to you. Women are underrepresented significantly on bank boards, and although their share has increased over time, they're still less than 20%. The second observation is that when we look at professional and social networks in the boardroom, those are male networks, right? And so this is a slide from a previous paper, and it shows you the number of connections between board members based on the gender of the connections. So that the first group of bars that you can barely see, those are connections between two women. Then we have connections between a man and a woman, and then the last large set of bars are connections between two men. So a big part of the explanation is that, well, of course, there's more men in the boardroom, but it's also true that each individual man, on average, has more connections than women do. So there's two things that are driving this. So these observations lead us to ask a couple of questions. First, how do within board networks affect the performance of the bank? And the second one is how is there a differential effect of connections for men and women? And so let me preview some of our findings. So we do find a differential effect. We find that more broadly connected female board members improve bank performance, and with the connections that the women have to men having the largest effect. We find some evidence that the exclusively male networks reduce performance. The impact of these connections is greatest when the women's share on the board is above the median. And we also look within important committees of the board and find the same thing. So you might be thinking, why is there a gender dimension to this question? And I'm going to tell you an idea that we have as to what this is. And when we're thinking about why is this, we have to take into account the context. So the context here is important. There's very few women on bank boards. And so what our thought is that these women who are connected to the other board members in this kind of male-dominated setting, they may be better integrated into the work of the board. And when you have more board members contributing, well, that could improve the functioning of the board. So that's kind of the big picture idea of what we think, why we think we're finding what we do. We plug into two different strands of the literature. First, there's a literature on social networks and performance. And there are papers within that literature that find that, well, social networks in the boardroom and with top management are actually bad for firm performance. They encourage cronyism. They reduce the incentive of the board to monitor the management. There's also some papers in this literature that find a positive effect of these connections when they help to improve information sharing. And then finally, I'll just remind you that what we find is that board networks are male networks. So all this literature that's studying the effect of networks are studying the effects of male networks. So we also then are going to have to think about some of the literature on gender diversity and team performance. And there's several papers in this literature that shows that gender diversity does improve firm performance, provided that women are integrated into the work of the board. There's also papers that show that gender diversity decreases performance, especially in the male-dominated context. And the idea behind this is that when women are in the very small minority, their salient characteristic is their gender and not their expertise. And so when that happens, their contributions can be downplayed. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more detail about our paper and how we're measuring connections. We're using a data set from Board X, and we're going to think about two different ways of measuring connections. The first one is is our main measure, and this is the one I'm going to present the results on today. But we're basically looking within the boardroom, and we're saying that two directors are connected if they were at the same institution or organization at some time prior to being on the same bank board. So they knew each other in some context before they started being on the board. We also calculated a weighted measure of these connections where we're going to weight it by the length of the connections. So connections that have longer duration are going to get a higher weight. I don't have time to present those results to you today, but I can tell you we find very similar findings when we use this weighted measure. So this is a little more detail on the data. These are all the different types of organizations that we have information about. And we have information for male and female directors. And it looks like a lot of organizations, but I would just point out that the vast majority of these connections are occurring at banks. So these board of directors know each other from relationships at prior banks. So when we think about this, we have to now take this individual level data and then construct a bank measure because our estimations are going to be at the bank level. So we're going to think about the individual board member. We're going to go into the boardroom, pick a board member, note the gender, go around the table, how many people did you know before you started, and note the gender of those connections. And that's going to allow us to not only count total connections, but look at the gendered dimension of those connections. And then we're going to have to average that up at the bank level because we want to get an average kind of connectedness of the board. And we are going to calculate a number of different indices that look at the gendered dimension of board connections. A few that I'll point out, we're going to look at the female connection index. That's the average number of connections of female board members. Female-female connection index is the average number of connections of female board members to other female board members. And then the female-male connection index is the average number of connections of female board members to male board members. So we can look at all those different dimensions. Here's just a few key summary statistics from the data. We have data from 554 US banks. We're looking at quarterly data over a 20-year period. This gives us over 11,000 unique individuals. In our data, the average woman is connected to 1.9 men and 0.1 women. We're ultimately interested in explaining bank performance. So we need some measures of bank performance, and we're going to use 4 of them. The first 3 are measures of profitability, return on equity, return on assets, net interest margin. The last one is earnings management. That's a measure of the quality of governance. And we're going to estimate that by basically running a regression where we predict loan loss reserves based on past loan losses and current delinquencies, taking the absolute value of that, dividing it by total loans, and using that as a proxy for earnings management. So when profitability goes up, obviously that's good performance, but when earnings management goes up, that's bad. Right? So we do have some identification challenges here because board composition is endogenous in an estimation of bank performance. If there's a couple of quarters of bad results, then there could be a change in the board. So we have to take that into account. And the way we're going to do that is our main method for doing that is we're going to run some IV estimations where we're using the cumulative deaths of connected directors as an instrument for board connections. And then we're going to supplement that with some difference in difference models where we're going to compare bank performance before and after the deaths of connected and unconnected directors. So with our IV estimation, this is the second stage. So YIT is one of our 4 measures of bank performance. We're going to include a 1/4 lagged value of our connection measure. We include some characteristics of the individual board members, average characteristics of the male board members, average characteristics of the female board members, some bank and balance sheet characteristics. We're going to have year-quarter fixed effects, bank fixed effects, and cluster the standard errors at the bank level. So these are our main results from the full sample. And what I'm focusing your attention on is the coefficients on the female connections measure. And what we find is that increases in female connections are associated with less earnings management, higher return on assets, higher return on equity, and higher net interest margin. We find that when we look at the female-male connections and also when we look at the female-female connections. So we're finding that consistently throughout. We don't find statistically significant results using this method when we look at the male connections. This is a graph that illustrates the magnitude of these impacts. So we're across all 4 estimation measures, we are increasing the connection measure by 1 standard deviation. And a pattern that you see is that orange bar is highest in all 4. And that's the index associated with female-male connections. So these are female members being connected to another male board member. And so our point estimates are suggesting to us that actually banks gain the most when a female board member is connected to a man. We kind of follow up on that idea with some difference in difference estimations. What you're looking at here is the result of a difference in difference estimate where we're looking at the deaths of male directors, and we want to know when the male director dies, is there a differential performance depending on who that director was connected to? So the results are similar across all 4 columns. So I'm going to focus your attention on this very first column. And these are the before estimates. So what this is telling us is that banks that had a connected director die subsequently had worse performance than the banks that had an unconnected director die. What's more interesting, though, is what happens after the connected man dies. And what the positive coefficient here is telling us is that after the connected male director dies, who is connected only to a man, bank performance improves. So that suggests that men who were connected only to men were depressing bank performance. After the male director dies, who is connected to both men and women, after that happens, bank performance declines, which suggests to us that, well, that director was actually doing something that was helping to improve performance. So to kind of summarize what we're finding from these different results, so in the before period, the connected directors whose death we ultimately record in the data are at banks with worse performance. But after the death of a male director who was only connected to men, the bank has improved performance. After the death of a male director who is connected to both men and women, the bank has worse performance. And we think these findings corroborate the conclusions from our IV estimations. The gender of the network connections matter, and male-female connections are valuable. And our kind of idea that I posed at the beginning was that, well, we think that what might be happening is that the men who are connected to women are being like a bridge between the people of different genders. Things. So to kind of leave you with some kind of just conclusions. So what are we finding? We're finding better connected female directors. They're associated with higher profitability and better governance in the banking industry. Additional connections of women to male directors are particularly valuable. Our difference in difference estimations suggest that exclusively male networks reduce performance. And our results, they're consistent with the interpretation that these connections are helping female board members gain influence. And just kind of more broadly, I think our results highlight the importance of considering the gender of networks when examining their impact. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So thanks for inviting me to discuss this paper, which was so interesting to read. I really enjoyed it. I work at the board, so the usual disclaimer applies. These are my views. Okay. So I thought I would just start out with sort of what we knew coming into this paper and then talk a little bit about what we learned, and then kind of maybe stretch the policy implications even a little bit further. So what do we know? So first, we know there's this literature about board gender diversity and firm performance. Bank boards have very few women. And we have this expectation that diverse teams are more productive, but the empirical results on gender diversity on boards is kind of mixed. And it seems to really depend critically upon the extent to which women are actually integrated into board work. So it's not just diversity, it's about inclusion. There's also this literature on board member networks and firm performance, and this can go kind of two ways. So firm performance might be worse if social and professional networks sort of foster cronyism and reduce sort of the incentive to monitor CEOs and employees. Or you could think there are efficiency gains from information sharing. And again, like the empirical results have been kind of mixed. And so what does this paper do in the context of kind of what we know? It says, do the networks of corporate board members affect firm profitability differently depending on sort of the gender of the board member and then also the gender of their network? So what do they find? There's kind of four main findings. The first is that additional connections, so these are social and professional type connections, increase firm profitability for female board members. So women who have thicker networks improve the profitability of the firm. That is differentially so when those connections are to men, so when women's networks involve men. And more so when there are other women on the board. So when a woman's not the only one on the board. And then finally, they find some kind of null or possibly negative evidence for men. So men who have thicker networks seem to potentially reduce firm profitability. And so the way that I interpreted this, and the authors interpret it too, and provide some really interesting kind of supporting anecdotal evidence, is that boards are only able to benefit from the productivity gains of having a diverse team when women are actually integrated into board decision making. And there's some really interesting anecdotes towards the end where in sort of a general setting, women complain about their contributions being dismissed and sort of not feeling like they're a part of this old boys network. And then there's some survey evidence that women who have more sort of thicker networks who are board members feel that they are able to sort of participate more equally in decision making than women who have sort of thinner networks. Okay. So what I kept thinking about was how we might sort of use these results and push them a little bit further and sort of thinking about the topic of this conference. And so, what we learn here that could be applied to fostering DE&I in economics and finance. And so this paper and others have shown that expanding diversity may not be enough if those diverse perspectives are not included in decision making. So if we, how do we foster inclusion? And this paper points to sort of a mechanism via which that can occur. And so women are more included when they have more network connections to the men and to a lesser extent women that they work with. And so then this raises a few other questions. So the first question that came up for me was, are these network connections just proxying for less diversity on some other dimension? So if I know the people I work with, is it because we all sort of are of the same social class or, of the same race and ethnicity, et cetera? Now, if that were the case, you would think maybe there wouldn't be a boost in firm profitability from the additional connections. That said, it might mean that these results are sort of attenuated from, what might be the case if we were able to foster inclusion in some other way that was, different than these sort of pre-existing social networks. And I thought, and this is sort of probably a big lift, but if there was sort of a way to kind of test this hypothesis, are the effects, coming from, people having gone to the same schools, which I know you do have in the data, that kind of thing. And so then the second question is, is this relationship between connections and sort of women being included in decision making and therefore affecting firm profitability, is this a causal relationship? And then what we really want to know is why. And so you could imagine kind of a few different mechanisms. The first would be sort of something like a reputation or a trust effect. So women who have thicker networks, those networks have experience with her and they, have learned to trust her opinion. You could also think that women with thicker networks are people who have more experience working in, a not very diverse field. And so they've learned to sort of navigate that environment or developed some, additional confidence to sort of speak up in a not diverse setting. And so I thought what might be really interesting, possibly, again, this might be a big lift, would be to try to look at some maybe of the additional sort of anecdotal survey evidence and try to get at some of these mechanisms. Why might it be the case that connections allow women to be more included? And then kind of thinking about this kind of another step further about how we might apply this, sort of in our own hiring decisions and for increasing DE&I, in our workplace, what are the policy solutions that we might sort of infer from what we find here? I think like a naive approach would be like, oh, maybe we should be searching for candidates within our existing professional networks. I think that's probably not the right approach. The reason we try not to do that anymore is that it's probably not increasing diversity. But I do think that there are probably some actionable policy solutions that could come out of this research. And so that would have to do with sort of understanding, again, why connections matter. So if connections matter because women who are connected sort of develop trust, that would point to things like unconscious bias training, things like that being kind of the right policy solution. But if it's the case that women with connections have just learned how to navigate that environment or have developed additional confidence, you would think something like mentorship and career coaching would be sort of the right policy approach. And then I have a lot of, some nitty-picky stuff on the empirics, but I think I will just give that directly to the authors and wrap up and say this was such an interesting paper to read, and thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, as with the first panel, the speakers were both brief, so we have time for questions. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Okay, thanks. I would like to ask you if on performance you have an effect on the short term versus long term. Because it could be that the effect you see like after, 1-2 years, but on the long term could be different. So I don't know if you also covered that in your paper. It would be nice to see that. And a little bit more on your IV. So could it be that instead of a death of a very well-connected man being beneficial for the firm, for the bank, it could be that actually this man has been replaced by another man with the same connection, but just better at his job?
Interesting. Good. Sarah? Oh, okay. Here, and then we'll come to Sarah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question a bit related to Maria Rosaria, long versus short-term impact. Can you study with your data a bit what Ghazala was saying this morning, was that the middle career is very important. So is it that more like gender boards have different organization in their firms? Because it's a bit sad, like let's say, to think that just appointing a woman gives a better performance in bank at the board. I mean, is that because she implements better policy in the firm that then have long-term impact on the performance?
Okay. We've got Sarah here, and then we've got one here and one there. Okay. Go ahead, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I am interested by your finding that the death of an executive who is wholly connected to men improves performance. So my question is that why does his death improve performance? Because he's substituted by men who are connected to women, or by women who are connected to women, or could it maybe be an intergenerational issue? So like the older men die and are giving way to younger men who are also maybe the same rate connected to other men, but it's just an intergeneral issue that they have better abilities and they just improve performance of the bank. So if the man is dying and like nobody's replacing it, productivity goes up anyway. So thank you.
Okay. All right. And
thank-
we've got one down here too, if you want. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. So I was just wondering if the number of connections, so that you can only have connections if you come from somewhere else. And does this say something about the type of institutions that the people have come from? I mean, and is it something about women coming in from outside and the type of institutions that they come from, and whether their previous institution was more or less diverse? And yeah, I don't quite understand the kind of the connection, like the connections that someone has if they just come through the one institution, and so yeah, just wondered whether there was something there.
Okay, good.
I was wondering to what extent sequencing might matter here. If I come into a board and I'm not connected yet, I probably need to make my connections, right? Whereas if I come into a board and there is already a connection sitting there, that might help me. So that might be my go-to person, and then I actually don't generate connections anymore. And would there be a difference between this male-female, right? Whether the male was first and the female comes second, or the other way around?
Okay. And I'm going to add one, if I can. It's maybe picking up on the sequencing question. Are these only pre-existing connections, or could we draw from this paper that some structured way to create those male-female connections afterwards would have an effect on performance?
So maybe I'll take them in reverse order. So the question about sequencing. So we are measuring in their data the connections that the individual had at the time they got appointed to the board. So it's already happened by the time we start kind of following them. I think kind of related to that is this question of, well, who replaces the people who die? So I think that's a really good question. I think on average, it's not going to be replaced by a man who's only connected to men. So we have, in this data set, we have, I think, over 250 male directors who died. So I think it's a large enough sample to think that there's going to be a variety of experiences. You know, just as an aside, we can't do this analysis for female board members because we don't have enough of them in our data that have died, so we can't actually do it. But I think that's actually a really...
Could also be improving performance.
Yes, right. But I think that is a good point. I think we could probably answer that question with the data, right? Is to see what happens. But that would be a good thing for us to do. I also think I would just point out, this is like a different paper that we had, but the connections are actually really important for getting appointed. Mm-hmm. So, especially at some of these smaller banks, you know, one of the things that we did do, we actually talked to some female directors, and that was where we got some of our anecdotal evidence from. And they're very open. You know, they will tell us that, you know, they need a new director. They go around the room and they say, who do you know? Right? And that's how they find or we need a woman. Who do you know? Right, and that's very direct how they end up recruiting these people. So that is an important point. We should think about whether or not that's good or not. What else was there? Yeah, and the question about long-term performance, we haven't followed that. We'd have to think a little bit about the method that we would use to do that, because these directors are changing over time, and so we'd have to think a little bit about the method, but that's actually a good question as well. And I appreciate the comments that we got. I think your why is like the $1 million question. It would be great to know that. I think more survey data would be great. We are trying to work with the American Bankers Association to see if we can survey some of these female directors, but they're a really tight-lipped group. They don't want to talk to us. The other way to approach it is, because these board meetings are confidential, so we can't really know what's going on in the boardroom, is to do some experimental work and to see whether we can tease out causes for that. But I think that's really great. I mean, I think in my own, I know this is tomorrow's topic, but in my own opinion, I think that the idea that, networks are improving performance, that's not the first best solution, right? Because there's other problems with using networks to improve performance. The first best solution, if what's really happening is it's about dynamics of people being included, the first best solution is to train people to run meetings so that everybody there is contributing, right?
Very good. Thank you.